The next trait of good leaders that we're going to take a look at is, I think, one of the most important. As I've shared it over the years, many have told me that it's made a major difference not only in how they lead, but in how they live. 50 years ago, management gurus of the business world, they were all excited about a new leadership principle called servant leadership. The concept was first introduced to the business world by Robert Greenleaf in an essay titled The Servant as Leader. Greenleaf had spent years working at AT&T when he developed his ideas after reading Hermann Hesse's novel titled Journey to the East. Greenleaf's essay contended that the best leaders are those who serve others first, focusing on the growth and well-being of their team members and their communities. All that was a major departure from traditional top-down leadership models that were prevalent at that time. Since its introduction, servant leadership has gained traction in management theory and in practice, influencing many organizations and leadership philosophies. All the secular world of business was doing was discovering something that Christians have known for 2,000 years because, well, it was a major theme of Jesus' training of his disciples. Since the earliest days of the church, Christians have understood Jesus' repeated call to be a servant. He flipped the world's ideas about what it means to be great by saying that the great in God's kingdom are servants, and the greatest of all is the servant of all. Of course, that made Jesus the greatest because by his sacrifice of himself potentially serving all. No one else can do that. A careful reading of those stories of Jesus' life that we call the Gospels reveals that more than any other single activity we see the disciples engaged in was arguing about who was the greatest among them. It seems they may have tried to keep that out of Jesus' awareness, but he knew and frequently used their competition as the backdrop to yet another teaching on the priority of being a servant. His supreme lesson on this was given at the Last Supper as recorded in the 13th chapter of John's Gospel. Well into their Passover meal, Jesus broke with the tradition of a usual Seder to wash the disciples' feet. Now, it was a serious breach of protocol because it was the task of the lowest servant of a household to perform that service. Jesus was their rabbi, their master. And some of them were hovering on the border of realizing that he was much more than that, august as the position of rabbi was. Some of the disciples, at least, held out the hope that he was the long-awaited Messiah. But now, as he knelt at their feet, he was taking the place of the lowest of servants, performing what they deemed a degrading task. When Jesus came to Peter, he resisted, probably thinking that what Jesus was doing was some kind of task that the other disciples had failed by allowing Jesus to wash their feet. And Jesus made it clear that Peter must let him serve him in that way. And once Jesus had made the round of all the disciples, he retook his seat at the table and returned to his role as their teacher, telling them that what he had just done, they must also do. After all, the goal of a disciple is to be just like the rabbi. They understood that Jesus did not mean that they all ought to, grab basins and wash each other's feet right then. He meant that being his follower meant taking the place of a servant perpetually. They weren't just to serve, they were to be servants. And that's what this episode is about, the difference between merely serving and being a servant. You see, many are those whose ambition is to be a leader who hear about servant leadership. And they glean from those around them, maybe from the institutional culture, that the way up, the way to gain promotion, is to adopt the philosophy of servant leadership. And so they do what they consider menial, trivial, degrading work. And they assume by doing so, they are paying their dues toward a promotion to the next level. Now, in a church setting that I'm familiar with, it may go something like this. A person will work in the nursery for 3 months and think that they have earned a promotion to teaching fourth graders, where after a year, they expect to be promoted to the junior hires. After a year there, they graduate to college and career ministry, and after 3 years there, they have paid their dues and they expect a promotion to senior pastor. They're serving, but they aren't servants. They're play-acting posers. The servant, that is, the person who is a servant, who identifies as a servant, doesn't assign value or importance to different kinds of work. Servants serve because they're servants, and whatever they're doing is what's important. It's what's needed. Now, all servants serve, but not all who serve are servants. They're mercenaries whose goal is promotion of self, and time will unmask them. Good leaders embrace their identity as servants. They are as content emptying trash as running a board meeting. They take as much care hosing a sidewalk as expounding a biblical text. Nothing is beneath their dignity to do if it makes the lives of others better. Some years ago, I attended a small conference that was held on the grounds of a very large church. The parking lot covered many acres. And one day at break time, I went outside for some fresh air. And as I sat on a bench, I saw the senior pastor of the church riding toward me across the parking lot in a golf cart. About halfway across the lot, he turned the cart around and drove back a bit and stopped. He took out one of those long-handled grabbers, picked up a piece of litter off the parking lot, dropped it into a little trash can inside the cart, then resumed his trip to the building where the conference was being held. That man led a globe-spanning ministry, had led many thousands of people to faith in Christ, had one of the largest churches in the country, and served as the leader of a movement of churches that at that time was well over 1,000. I'm sure he employed at least a dozen janitors to maintain the church facilities and its schools. But he saw a piece of litter and went out of his way to pick it up. Here's why. He never lost his grip on who and what he really was, a servant of God who served the one he could not see by serving those that he could. I hope you see the crucial distinction between merely serving and being a servant. Servants serve because they see a need and they're able to meet it. Personal desire does not factor into whether or not to engage. As long as helping doesn't interfere with fulfilling their sworn obligations and responsibilities, it's what they see themselves already committed to. Those who eschew being a servant and merely serve in the pursuit of promotion are forever saying, well, that's not my job. You can tell if you're really a servant or merely serving by how you react when you're treated like one. If you're just paying dues, when someone treats you as a servant, you get offended and put out. When you own the identity of a servant, you expect to be treated like one because you are. A famous but now retired general was invited to speak at a black tie banquet. As was his custom, he arrived early, wanting to see the room and get a feel for the layout of the place. Dressed in regular street clothes, his tuxedo was in the car as he planned to change later. He parked in the service area behind the hotel, near to where the catering trucks were unloading. His plan was to walk through the kitchen and into the dining hall, but as he entered the kitchen, a manager, assuming that he was one of the catering staff, told him to hurry up and bring in the food. The general turned around, saw the caterer's truck nearby, and went to grab one of the trays being handed out. He followed the others into the kitchen, then went back out for another tray of food. Several trips later, the hotel manager happened to be passing through the kitchen and saw the general. He recognized him as the main speaker of the event the hotel was hosting. He was aghast that this important man was carrying food trays and asked him what he was doing. The general told him what had happened. Well, this supervisor was embarrassed and said that he would fire that manager who had pressed him into service. The general asked him, "Don't do that." In fact, he said that would be quite inappropriate because the general had not corrected the manager. He saw no need to. The caterer obviously needed help, and he was happy to render it. No wonder that man was asked to be the main speaker at such an important event. He obviously had become a well-respected general because he understood and lived what makes a great leader. Here's another tell on owning our identity as a servant. Servants are especially sensitive to other servants and treat them with courtesy and kindness. Mistreating waitstaff, counter workers, attendants, and cashiers, that's a telling sign. It's been interesting going out to dinner with so-called Christian celebrities because fame doesn't always equal spiritual maturity and Christ-likeness. People who embrace their identity as a servant are attentive to waiters and waitresses. When they come to the table, they turn their attention to them. Mere posers ignore them and act as though they're being interrupted when it's time to order or the food comes. Genuine servants defer to other servants because they know how difficult it can be serving those who are busy figuring out where they rank among those around the table. In light of how often Jesus taught the disciples on the importance of not just serving, but of being a servant, it behooves us to spend some time making sure it's a lesson that we take to heart and put into practice. Don't just serve, be a servant.